The landlady had put a wireless on in the public bar at 6:30, which Remus thought was either very hopeful or very insensitive, and he had been sitting at the corner table since then, trying to decide which. He had not slept. He had come down from his room at 4 in the morning and found the common room already warm and agitated. 2 old men in dressing gowns who had heard the news on the wireless and couldn't stop themselves from telling each other about it, shaking each other's hands, filling glasses from behind the bar as if the landlady had already given permission. "The war is over," one of them had said, which was not quite right, but close enough. "He's gone," one of them had said. "The Dark Lord's gone." And then they had noticed Remus standing at the foot of the stairs in his coat, with nowhere to be, and they had looked at him the way people looked at young men who appeared unaccountably unmoved by good news, which was with a species of gentle suspicion. He had gone to the table in the corner. He had said nothing. He had asked for tea when the landlady appeared, which she brought without looking at him twice. By 6, the wireless was playing a program that kept interrupting itself with updates. By 7, it was all updates, no program. By 8:30, the pub had filled, not with drinkers particularly, but with people who needed somewhere to be while they felt things. Strangers were shaking hands. A witch in her work robes was weeping into somebody's shoulder, and that somebody was patting her back and weeping too, softly, in the manner of a person who was not entirely sure why they were doing it. A man in a pointed hat had come in with a bottle of fire whiskey and left it on the bar with a note that said something Remus couldn't read from where he was sitting. The pub was loud with relief, and something under the relief, something he could hear in the way people were laughing just slightly too hard, was fear that it wasn't really over, that they had just gotten used to being afraid, that the absence of the thing you have been terrified of does not immediately feel safe. He understood that, at least. His tea was cold. He had drunk about half of it before it happened, and then let it go cold because his hands had stopped doing useful things. James, he was thinking. He had been thinking it since 3 in the morning, not in complete sentences, just the name, and then nothing, and then the name again. James. Dead. Lily. Dead. And then the one that sat differently in his chest, complicated in a way the other 2 were not, the one he couldn't hold cleanly, Sirius, who had been the secret keeper. Everyone knew now it was on the wireless. It was in every conversation happening around him in this pub. Sirius, who had told Voldemort where James and Lily were hiding, and who had then, the wireless said, tracked Peter down on a Muggle street and murdered 12 bystanders in the explosion, blown his own supposed friend to pieces until all that remained was a finger and a blood-stained cloak. Peter. Dead. Remus sat with his cold tea and placed those 4 names in a row and looked at what they left behind. 4 of them. Once. He did not finish the thought. The pub was very full, and he was very much alone in it, which was not a new sensation, but had not previously felt quite so precise, so geometrically exact. He was aware of his own outlines in a way that was uncomfortable. He was a person who occupied space, who had a shadow, who was sitting in a chair. He had thought, at various points in the last year, about what he would do if James died. Not often. It wasn't something he let himself dwell on. But in the small hours sometimes, when the war felt close, the thought had arrived, and he had put it away quickly. The way you close a drawer that won't quite catch. He had not thought about what it would do to him. He was finding out now. He was aware that he had a coat on, and that the coat was old, and that there was a hole in the left cuff that he had been meaning to mend since September, and that James had noticed it in August and said something about it, and he had said something back about James's complete inability to keep his glasses from sliding down his nose. He remembered that James had pushed his glasses up with one finger, an automatic gesture, barely conscious, and had grinned. He had a very clear image of that grin. He didn't look at it for long. A woman across the bar raised her glass and said something, and the room raised glasses with her. And somewhere behind Remus, someone said, "You know who," and someone else made a shushing sound, and then laughed, as though the shushing was now unnecessary, as though they were all allowed to stop being afraid. A child of maybe 5 or 6 was sitting on a man's shoulders near the door, wearing a paper crown that someone had fashioned from a page of the Prophet, the headline visible upside down, "He is gone." The child had no idea what had happened. The paper crown kept sliding over her left ear, and the man kept straightening it, absently, without looking up from his conversation. Remus watched the child for a while. He put his money on the table, more than the tea cost, because the landlady had been kind and left him alone. And then he thought about the money, which required serious consideration, because he had so little of it, and had just left considerably more than necessary on a pub table. He stood up anyway. He tucked his chair in. He walked through the common room without looking at anyone, and pushed through the door and out. It was November. It was cold, clear and sharp, the kind of cold that came with a blue sky rather than grey clouds, the kind that looked like winter pretending to be cheerful. People were on the street. A woman in green robes was transfiguring confetti from a piece of parchment and letting it scatter over the pavement. Down the road, someone had conjured lights, pale and drifting in the still air above the post office. 2 wizards were embracing near the corner and making no effort to stop. A muggle was walking past on the other side of the road, looking confused, but not alarmed, which meant the lights probably weren't visible to her, which meant someone had done the charm badly or quickly, which meant it didn't matter today. Nothing like that mattered today. Remus turned and walked the other direction. The sound of cheering reached him from somewhere above, a window thrown open, a voice, and it followed him for most of a block before the distance swallowed it. There was nowhere to go. He did not have a home in any sense of the word that mattered. There was a room, above the pub, with a single window and a bed that tilted slightly to the left, but that was a room he was paying for by the night, and the night was over. He walked. The cold found the hole in his cuff. He knew James's son was alive. The wireless had been saying it since before dawn. The boy who lived, the boy who survived, and people's voices had done something peculiar around the words, gone quiet and careful, because they didn't quite know how to say what had happened to a 15-month-old child who had survived a killing curse and still have it mean what it meant. He knew the child was alive. What he did not know was where. He did not know that somewhere to the south, in a quiet street in a part of Surrey he had never heard of, James's son was already asleep on a stranger's doorstep, wrapped in a blanket, with a letter tucked beside him that he could not yet read. He walked. The morning opened up ahead of him, clear and without purpose, and he put his hands in his pockets and walked into it. He arrived in the village before anyone was awake, in the cold grey hour just before the light changes. The apparition point had been a field at the edge of the village, the kind of unoccupied ground that exists at the boundary of most English villages, and he had walked in from there along a frost-stiff track that joined the main lane somewhere near the churchyard, in the dark, with the cold coming up through the soles of his boots and the sky beginning, very slowly, to go from black to grey. The village was called Godric's Hollow, which he had known by name for 2 years and visited once. It looked, in the early morning of November the 2nd, exactly as it had looked when James and Lily had brought him here in the summer of 1979 to help carry boxes, low stone walls, a church with a short square tower, a post box set into a garden wall, the smell of wood smoke from a chimney somewhere above. An ordinary English village. The kind of place where nothing had ever happened to anyone, which Remus understood now as the thing Dumbledore had presumably relied on. He stood at the junction of the lane and the track for a moment and looked at it. One of these cottages had been James Potter's house. Had been James Potter's house for a year and a half, and before that had been someone else's entirely, and in that entire ordinary history there had been nothing remarkable about it until 3 nights ago, when something enormous had entered it and rearranged everything. He walked down the lane. The churchyard was on his right as he passed it. He did not stop. He was here for one thing, and he did not think he could afford to stop for anything else. Not yet. He found the cottage by the rubble more than by the structure. What remained was a shell, the ground floor largely intact, but the front wall buckled outward, the roof above the upper floor simply gone, open to the pale November sky. The garden gate was off one hinge, left swinging. There was debris in the front garden, timber, a scatter of shattered slate, a spill of paperback books that had somehow ended up on the lawn, their covers swollen from the rain that must have fallen in the night. A wizard in ministry robes was further up the lane, his back to Remus, working a spell over a stone plinth at the edge of the village green. Remus was certain the plinth had not been there the last time he had been here. As he watched, the stone shifted. It did not so much change as clarify itself. The way a word becomes legible when you finally find the right distance to look at it, and resolved into 2 figures standing together. James with one arm around Lily's shoulders and the other extended toward something Remus couldn't see from this angle. Between them, presumably. There would be a child between them. That was the shape of it. Remus looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the ruined house instead, which was easier and also not easier at all. He pushed the garden gate. It swung inward with a sound like a complaint and stopped halfway, the buckled hinge giving up. He left it and walked up the front path between the dead November grass. The front door was not properly shut. The latch had been forced by whatever had moved through this house, and he pushed it, and it opened, and he went inside. The hallway smelled of plaster dust and something scorched, and underneath both of those things, faint but insistent, something that was simply the smell of the house, the particular aggregate of a family, wood smoke and old books, and the slightly unidentifiable cologne James had been using since 5th year that everyone had told him was awful, and he had found deeply amusing. There was a dark mark on the wall to the left of the front door that he did not look at directly. A coat hook on the wall still had 2 coats on it, a cloak of James's, grey wool, slightly too large, and a scarf of Lily's, green, hanging as if this were an ordinary Tuesday, and the family were simply out for the morning. He stood in the hallway and looked at the green scarf for longer than he meant to. He thought, she bought that in Hogsmeade in their 7th year, the afternoon after a Quidditch match, because James had forgotten his scarf and spent 3 hours complaining about the cold until she dragged him into Gladrags and made him try on various increasingly absurd options, and she had bought the green one for herself while he wasn't paying attention, and she had worn it every winter since. He thought, I have never known a person who could make a scarf look like a position statement. But Lily Evans managed it. He stopped thinking. The staircase was directly ahead of him. The nursery was up there. He had been up those stairs once, briefly in the summer. James showing him around with the proprietary pride of someone who had done nothing to create the thing they were proud of, except choose it, pointing out the room they'd painted, the cot, the mobile of enchanted stars that Lily had made, and Sirius had offered to improve, and they had spent 4 hours arguing about what constellations to include, which had been a spectacularly unhelpful contribution. He did not look at the stairs. He turned left. The sitting room was largely undisturbed. The sofa was still where it had been. A lamp had fallen and not broken. There was a low bookshelf with a framed photograph on top of it. James and Lily at some occasion he didn't recognize, his arm around her, her head tipped back in a laugh. And he looked at the photograph for exactly as long as he could stand it, and then crossed the room to the door on the far side and went through it. James's study. He stood in the doorway for a moment. It looked like James's study, which was to say it looked like scholarly chaos, organized by someone who found systematic order, both in principle and, to the touch, slightly alarming. Books stacked in 3 columns that were clearly intended to constitute a system. A Quidditch magazine on top of a Defense Against the Dark Arts text, as though this were perfectly logical. An ink stain on the desk large enough to qualify as its own landmark. A small jar of something that had crystallized shut. The sneakoscope on the windowsill was inert, and the window was intact, and the study was otherwise entirely ordinary, and entirely, unmistakably, his. The floorboard near the desk was the first wrong thing. A section of it had been forced upward from below, not broken, but pressured open, the way a sealed container opens when the force building beneath it exceeds the seal. The board had split along its grain. The gap underneath was dark and about the width of a spread hand. Remus crouched down. He put his hand into the gap, carefully, and touched paper. He drew it out. An envelope, sealed. The paper was slightly cool from the space below the floor and otherwise completely undamaged, as if whatever had happened in this house on the night of October 31st had simply declined to touch it. His name. On the front. James's handwriting. He stayed crouched on the floor of James's study for a long time after that. He was not doing anything. He was holding the envelope in both hands and not opening it, because opening it meant something he had no room for yet, and not putting it down, because putting it down would mean leaving it, and he found he couldn't do either of those things. He did the only third thing available to him, which was to stay where he was and hold it, and feel the weight of it, which was very slight, a folded page or 2 at most, and which nonetheless seemed, at that moment, to be heavier than most things he had ever held. From somewhere outside, through the intact study window, he heard the ministry wizard clear his throat and mutter a low incantation, the sound of someone doing a job, competently and without particular feeling, the ordinary, uninvested sounds of the world continuing. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his coat against his chest. He stood. He walked back through the sitting room and did not look at the photograph on the bookshelf. He went into the hallway and did not look at the stairs. He looked at Lily's green scarf on the hook by the door, briefly, and then he looked away from that too. He walked out of the front door. He pulled it shut behind him, out of habit, the habit of leaving houses correctly, of not simply walking away from things, and it didn't catch, and he let it go. He walked down the front path. He went through the lopsided garden gate and out into the lane. The ministry wizard had his back to him and did not look up. The statue was complete now, the stone family, the stone reaching arm, the expressions of 2 people caught in an ordinary moment and turned permanently to stone. He walked back up the lane without looking at it. The rented room had a low window that looked out on a car park, and a single bed with a headboard that leaned against the wall at an angle suggesting the screws had been loose for some time, and a small table near the window with 2 chairs that matched only in the sense that they were both chairs. Remus had taken the room at a muggle bed and breakfast in a town he had come through on the way back from Godric's Hollow. He hadn't been willing to apparate directly to anywhere he knew, not tonight, not with this in his coat pocket against his chest, and he was sitting in one of the 2 chairs with his coat off and his boots off, and clean clothes on that were only marginally drier than the ones he'd removed, because he had packed nothing and bought nothing, and the only dry clothes he had were the ones he'd left in his room that morning, which he had paid for a second night simply to have access to. He had not eaten. He had stood in the bathroom for a while and looked at himself in the mirror, which told him he looked like someone who had not slept in 2 days, which was correct, and nothing else of use. The envelope was on the table. He was facing it. He had put it there when he came in. He had not touched it since. That had been just over an hour ago. He had made tea in the small kettle on the dresser and drunk it cold without noticing, and made a second cup and left that one too. The envelope sat in the lamplight with his name on the front in James's handwriting, and showed no particular sign of doing anything about this on its own. He picked it up. The seal was plain red wax, no sigil. His name on the front pressed a little too deep into the paper, the way James's handwriting always had, slanting right and bearing down on the descenders. He turned the envelope over once in his hands. Then he broke the seal and took out what was inside. 2 pages, close written. Dated in the upper right corner, the 13th of October, 1981. 18 days before the attack. He read, "Mooney, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong, and I'm going to trust you to have worked out the specifics, because I don't actually want to write them down. The thing about writing things down is that it makes them more real than thinking them, and I've been keeping certain things at the level of thinking rather than writing for some months now, and I'd like to hold that particular line a little longer if I can. I want to say some things I haven't managed to say properly in the ordinary way. I know that by the time you read this, I'll have had, apparently, plenty of opportunities to say these things to your face, and chosen not to, which I'll admit reflects badly on me. Call it a character defect. You've put up with worse. The first thing is, thank you. For 5th year. Specifically. You know what I mean. And I'm not going to describe it in detail because even thinking about the specific events still makes me want to apologize to several people I haven't spoken to in years, and I can't afford the distraction right now. The short version is this. There was a long stretch of time when I was not the person I wanted to be, and definitely not the person Lily eventually agreed to marry, and during that time you stayed when you could reasonably have decided I wasn't worth it. I knew you were making a choice. I said nothing about it, which was cowardly. I'm saying it now. The second thing, I am sorry we didn't tell you about our new arrangement. We switched, partway through, for reasons that still make sense to me, and that I hope will make sense to you. The logic was that the fewer people who knew about the change, the safer everyone would be, and that logic was sound. I stand by it. But I know you, and I know you're going to mind, and I want it on record that the decision had nothing to do with trust, nothing whatsoever. You are, in my considered opinion, the least untrustworthy person I have ever known. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry you found out the way you found out. The third thing is more difficult to put into words, so I'll put it simply. I hope Sirius is with you when you read this. I know there are ways this could have gone where that won't be possible, and if it's gone that way, then I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that, and for the fact that nothing I can write here will help with it. He is my first and best friend. I don't have a better way to say that, and I don't think I need one. The fourth thing, this is the part I've been working my way toward, is that I need to tell you about Harry. Remus put the letter down on the table. He looked at the car park outside the window. A yellow light had come on above a door somewhere, and it made a small, cold pool of brightness on the tarmac. He looked at it for a moment, and then picked the letter back up. He has Lily's eyes. I want you to know that they look different on a 1-year-old than you'd expect. More alarming, somehow, and greener than I remembered green being, like she managed to concentrate something when she handed it down. He has my hair, which Lily finds tremendously funny, and which I maintain is a fine quality of hair, simply spirited. Lily says he's going to spend his whole childhood fighting it, and I say that builds character, and we have agreed to disagree on this point and on several others relating to how one raises an athlete. He laughs at things before I understand why. He has located the cat and formed a strong and complex opinion about it. He found the toy broomstick, only 2 feet off the ground, barely qualifies as aviation. And that was that. It became his central concern, the matter to which all other matters were secondary. The focus on that child when he's moving is something I can't describe to you in a way that does it justice. You'll have to see it for yourself. Remus, if you're reading this, we're gone, and I need you to do something for me. Don't come charging in. Don't do anything dramatic. I know the dramatic instinct belongs mostly to me and not to you, but I'm saying it anyway, because what I'm about to ask is much smaller than that, and I need you to hear it as the small thing it is. Find Harry, not to take him anywhere, not to change anything that's been arranged. Just find him. See that he gets to know someone who remembers who we were. That's all I'm asking of you, Remus. Just that. Someone has to be able to tell him his mother laughed with her whole face. Someone has to be able to tell him his father was a better person than he started out being, and that he knew it, and that he was working on it. Tell him whatever you can spare. Don't let him grow up without a story. He'll need one. I trust you to know how to do this. You've always known things like that. James Remus read the letter. He put it down and read it again from the beginning. He read it a 3rd time, more slowly. The way you read something when you can tell it isn't all going in properly, when certain sentences pass through you like light through water, and you can feel you haven't understood them. There was a section, the 3rd thing, about Sirius, and he went past it. Not deliberately, or maybe deliberately, he wasn't sure. He read the words, and they did not attach to anything. He did not have anywhere to put them tonight. He knew what it would cost him to stop at that passage, and he was not ready to pay it. There was a clause about himself, near the end, tucked inside a longer sentence about the toy broomstick, almost missed. And he went past that too, his eyes moving ahead before he'd fully registered what he'd read. He noted it the way you note a door in a burning building. Later. Not now. The parts of the letter he could hold tonight were these. The hair, the eyes, the toy broomstick, 2 feet off the ground, the focus on that child's face. Someone has to tell him. Don't let him grow up without a story. He folded the letter along its original creases, 2 vertical folds and 1 horizontal. The creases of someone who had known the paper would need to fit inside a pocket, and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was hanging on the back of the door. He felt the slight weight of it settle there, against nothing, with the coat off the hook. He sat back down at the table. He drank some of the cold tea. Outside the window, the yellow light above the door was still on, and the car park was still empty, and the night was doing what November nights do, which is to say, it was simply dark and cold and continuing. He did not know where Harry was. He knew the child was alive somewhere. The wireless had been saying that since yesterday, but he didn't know where. He knew one person who had been there, at Godric's Hollow, the night it happened. One person who had seen the child and held him and carried him somewhere. Who would know the address? Who had orders and would not want to violate them? He had never, in 21 years, been particularly deterred by what people wanted. He went to Scotland. He apparated to the edge of Hogsmeade in the early morning of November the 3rd, cold and bright, the Highland mountains stark against a blue sky that had no business being that colour in November, and walked the path he knew from memory, the one that wound up through the forest toward the iron gates of the school. The trees had lost most of their leaves, and the frost was still on the ground where the sun had not reached it, and through the gaps in the branches the castle was visible above. Grey towers, smoke from the upper chimneys, the lake a flat pewter colour in the morning light. It had not changed. It had not changed at all. He had not walked this path since spring, the last order meeting before Dumbledore had decided things were too dangerous to continue, and the walk felt different now. The path was the same. The castle was the same. The gates, when he reached them, were the same. High iron, griffins on the pillars, the enchantments rippling faintly in the cold air. What was different was that the last time he had walked up this path, he had known exactly who he was walking toward, and now the list of people he could walk toward anywhere in the world had become very short, very quickly. Today was Sirius's birthday. He noted this without looking at it directly, and kept walking. He found Hagrid almost at once. He had known he would. Hagrid was not difficult to locate, and he was not inside the castle. On a morning like this, he would be somewhere on the grounds, because the grounds were his, the way the school itself was Dumbledore's. He was at the far edge of the lawn near the gates, a colossal figure in an enormous moleskin overcoat, apparently working on a section of fencing that had gone crooked. He had a handkerchief in one hand. It was the size of a small sail and still barely adequate, which he was pressing to his face while he worked, so that the working and the weeping were happening simultaneously in the manner of something that had been going on without interruption for several days, and had simply become the state of things. Remus stopped at a reasonable distance and said his name. Hagrid turned. His eyes were nearly swollen shut, 2 days of continuous grieving, making itself visible on a face large enough to show the evidence plainly. He was still himself, still enormous, still warm, still recognizably the person who had pressed small sandwiches on Remus at order meetings, and remembered everyone's birthday, and wept openly at the news of any death, good or bad. But he looked as though the world had sat on him and shown no sign of getting up. "Remus," Hagrid said, and his voice had the particular texture of someone who is not surprised to see a face they love, but had not let themselves hope for it. They stood. There was nothing adequate to say. Remus had discovered, over the last 2 days, that there was very little adequate to say about most things. And the things that were adequate, I know, I'm sorry, me too, he found he could not say without meaning them beyond his ability to mean things right now. And so he stayed quiet and trusted that this was comprehensible. "I heard about the Fidelius," he said at last. "I know why Dumbledore didn't tell me. I'm not angry about it." This was not entirely true, but it was true enough to say. Hagrid's face moved through something complicated. He looked down at the handkerchief, then back up. "Dumbledore said not to tell anyone where Harry's been taken," he said. He said Harry's name carefully, as if it were a thing that might break under insufficient care. "He's got reasons. I don't always know what they are, but he's always got good reasons, and I wouldn't go against him. You know I wouldn't." "I know," Remus said. "I'd want to. I'd want to tell you." His voice broke on the want, right in the middle of it, and he pressed the handkerchief to his eyes and collected himself by main force. James was my friend, and Lily, and they'd have wanted," He stopped again. Yes, Remus said. They would have. But Dumbledore said, I know. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. Two people who knew each other well enough to be in pain together without needing to perform anything. The cold came off the mountains. The castle smoke drifted in the blue above. Hagrid, Remus said, I need to know where he is. I'm not going to take him anywhere. I'm not going to do anything that interferes with whatever Dumbledore has arranged. I just need to know. Hagrid shook his enormous head slowly, the handkerchief pressed against his beard. I can't. I know you don't want to. It's not that I don't want to. I can't. Dumbledore trusted me. He trusted me to bring Harry there safe and to not go blabbing about where there is, and I can't. Remus, I can't. He looked genuinely stricken by the impossibility of his own position, a man held between two loyalties in a way that was visibly too small a space to hold him. Remus reached into his coat. He took out the letter, folded, and held it for a moment before opening it to the second page. Not the beginning, not the parts about other things, just the last section, where James had written what he needed Remus to do, and he held it out so Hagrid could see the handwriting. Not the whole page, just the line at the bottom of it. Don't let him grow up without a story. He'll need one. Hagrid took the letter in his enormous hands. He held it the way enormous hands hold small things, with great care and slight uncertainty about their own strength. He read the line. He read it again. His hands were shaking slightly, and he was weeping again in the way he had been weeping since October 31st, steadily, like something that had simply been switched on and no one had found the switch to turn it off. Where did you find this? He managed. Godric's Hollow, the study. James hid it under the floorboards before the end. Hagrid nodded, slowly, and handed the letter back with the careful precision of someone returning something that belongs to the dead. He sat down on a boulder at the edge of the path. It was not quite big enough for him, but he sat on it anyway, and it accepted him, and he looked at the frost-tipped grass. Sorry, he said, after a long moment. Little whinging. 4 Privet Drive. He said it the way you say something you have been holding that was not yours to give but that you are giving anyway, because the weight of keeping it has become greater than the reason for keeping it. A Muggle family. Dursley, they're called. Petunia, his aunt, on his mum's side. Dumbledore left a letter. He looked up. His eyes were red and swollen, and entirely uncomplicated, sincere. He's got her eyes, Hagrid said. Lily's eyes. Green. Just exactly like hers. Remus put the letter back in his inside pocket. He felt the address settle alongside it. Surrey, Little Whinging, Privet Drive, a Muggle house at the end of a name. And the weight of the two things together, the letter and the knowledge, was not quite real yet, but would be. Please don't tell Dumbledore it was me, Hagrid said. His voice was very quiet for a person his size. That told you. Please, Remus. Remus looked at him for a moment. He did not say yes. He did not say, I promise. He buttoned his coat against the cold. He turned and walked back toward the gate. He heard, behind him, the sound of Hagrid settling further onto the boulder that was too small for him, and the wet compression of the handkerchief. And then he was through the gate and onto the path, through the trees, and the sound faded, and there was only the cold wind from the mountains, and the frost still on the ground, and the thought of a green-eyed boy in a house in Surrey, at the end of an address, waiting for someone who remembered who his parents were. He did not apparate directly into the street. He had learned, during the war, that appearing in the middle of a Muggle residential area in wizard's robes was the kind of thing that attracted attention, and right now, attention was the last thing he needed. He landed instead at the edge of a common, a flat stretch of grass with a football pitch marked in white chalk, empty at this hour, the posts standing against a grey November sky. He stood there for a moment with his coat pulled around him and his breath fogging in the cold, and then he walked. Privet Drive was 3 streets away. He had written the address down that morning on a scrap of paper, Surrey, Little Whinging, 4 Privet Drive, and folded it into his pocket alongside James's letter. He had not opened either of them since Scotland. He hadn't needed to. The streets of Little Whinging in early November had a quality he couldn't quite name, a particular tidiness, the tidiness of somewhere that had decided on itself and kept to the decision. There were no loose gate latches. There were no unraked leaves left more than a day on the front paths. The bins were at the edges of the front walls rather than cluttering the pavement, not because anyone had told residents to put them there, but because this was the kind of street where people noticed when a bin was in the wrong place and quietly moved it. He had grown up in a town not unlike this one, and he remembered the feeling of it, the low, ongoing pressure of being watched by nothing in particular, by the aggregate expectation of the street itself. He found Privet Drive without difficulty. He turned the corner and recognized it immediately, not because anything distinguished it from the streets around it, but precisely because nothing did. The houses were identical in the way of houses built by a system that had decided what houses should be, and then repeated itself indefinitely. The same red brick, the same white window frames, the same front gardens at slightly different stages of autumn, some still with a few stubborn yellow leaves clinging to the shrubs, some stripped clean, one with a young family's tricycle left on the front path that someone would come out for in the morning. The street lights had come on. Their orange glow turned the whole street the particular shade that English suburban evenings are, everywhere, from November through February, without variation. He walked along the pavement and read the numbers on the gates. Number 4. It was not different from any of the others. He had known this, on some level. 4 Privet Drive was an address, not a landmark, but knowing it had not prepared him for the reality of standing in front of it. The house where James Potter's son had been placed 3 nights ago was unremarkable in every possible way. The right size, the right color, 2 windows upstairs and 2 down, a net curtain in the front downstairs window. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see a lamp turned on in the sitting room, and the blue and white flicker of a television, and the back of an armchair. He stopped on the pavement outside the front gate. The sitting room had someone in it. He could see the silhouette in the armchair, a person facing the television, not moving. In the back of the house, through the sitting room and the open doorway beyond it, a kitchen window showed another light, a sharper, more practical light, and in it a second silhouette, angular and thin-shouldered, moving between what was presumably the hob and what was presumably the sink. She moved with the efficiency of someone in the middle of a routine she had done several hundred times and did not need to think about. He looked at the upper floor. The front window on the right was dark. The front window on the left had a thin, soft light in it. Not the light of a lamp, but the light of something smaller and lower, the kind of light meant to be left on through the night. He was not certain about this. He stood and looked at the light and was not certain. From somewhere inside, the upper floor, he thought, though the distance made it difficult to locate, there was a sound. He held very still and listened. A baby's sound, or something close to it. Not crying, not quite, but the particular vocalizing of a very small person who was not yet asleep and had something to say about that. Then quiet. Then a smaller, different sound from a different direction in the house that he could not quite separate from the other sounds. Traffic a street over, the television, the ordinary ambient noise of a suburban evening. He stood outside the gate for an hour. He did not go up the front path. He did not open the gate. The cold deepened. It always did, after full dark, in early November, and it came in off the pavement and off the brick of the garden wall, and found its way, as cold always found its way, through the gap at his left cuff and down the back of his collar. He stood and watched the house, and did not move toward the door. He was not ready. That was the thing, or one of the things. He had come all this way. Godric's Hollow, Scotland, 3 muggle streets from a common with a chalk-marked football pitch. And now he was here. And he did not know what he would say if he knocked. He had James's letter and James's specific instruction. Find Harry. Tell him stories. Don't let him grow up without a name for his father. These seemed, on the train from Scotland, like sufficient equipment. They seemed, standing outside a perfectly ordinary gate in Surrey, like insufficient equipment for the conversation he would have to have with a woman who didn't want him there. He did not know if she would open the door. He did not know what Dumbledore's letter had told her, or whether it had mentioned anything about people like him turning up. He suspected not. He looked at the light in the upper left window. A man came along the pavement with a dog, a Labrador, broad and cheerful, pulling ahead of its owner with the specific optimism of dogs on their evening walk, interested in everything. The man was middle-aged, in a wax jacket, and he looked at Remus with the expression of someone who has noted a thin young man in old-fashioned clothes standing motionless on the pavement for no apparent reason, and has formed a view about it. Remus put his hands in his pockets and looked at the gatepost until the man and the dog had gone. He walked away. He turned left at the end of the road and followed a street he didn't know until he found a small park, a square of grass with a path through it, a bench near the centre, a recently painted metal bin at the entrance. He sat down on the bench. His back ached from standing, which was an indignity he felt at 21 he had not yet earned. The cold here was more pronounced than it had been on Privet Drive, away from the sheltering line of houses, and it settled in quickly. There was a chip shop 2 streets over. He had a handful of Muggle coins in his pocket. He'd exchanged a few sickles before he left Hogsmeade, and he counted them and found he had enough for tea if they sold it. And they did. It came in a polystyrene cup with a lid, and it was approximately the right temperature and almost entirely without taste. He had stopped tasting things properly on Wednesday, so this was not a surprise. He carried it back to the bench and sat with it and watched the road beyond the park. The chip shop window was a rectangle of yellow steam. A car went past, then another. The sodium light on the lamp post made everything at the edge of its pool a faint shade of amber that was not quite warm. He drank the tea and looked at the street and thought, without meaning to, about the soft light in the upper left window of number 4. Night lights were for children who were afraid of the dark. A 15-month-old was not afraid of the dark, not yet. Darkness was simply an absence to a child that young, without the content that made it frightening. Someone had put the nightlight there for their own peace of mind. Someone was awake at night, worrying about whether the child was all right. He had not expected to think anything charitable about the Dursley household, and he was not sure this counted as charitable exactly. But it was something. He went back at midnight. He wasn't entirely sure why. The street was quiet and dark, the television off, the kitchen light off, the street lit only by the lamp posts, the parked cars casting long shadows on the road. The upper left window of number 4 was still softly lit. He stood at the gate and looked at it for a few minutes. Then he walked to the far end of the street, where a dry cleaning shop had closed for the evening, and left a recessed doorway that was not visible from the road. He sat down in it with his coat around him, and his back against the door, and his knees drawn up. The pavement was cold and hard. During the war, he had slept in worse places, twice, and he had managed. He closed his eyes. The routine was the important thing. If you had a routine, mornings happened without you having to think about them, which was an advantage, because Petunia Dursley was finding that thinking, in the first week of November, had a tendency to arrive somewhere she preferred not to be. Vernon left at 7:30. She heard the front door close, the particular familiar sound of it, and felt the house settle into the shape it had when she was alone in it. She was not quite alone in it now, and this was the difficulty. There was Dudley in his high chair at the kitchen table, working through his porridge with the dedication of a person with strong opinions about porridge. There was the house itself, ticking in its ordinary way around the breakfast things, and the radio left on low, and the November garden outside the window. And there was the third thing, the presence upstairs. She could hear it. She could always hear it now. The sounds a baby makes when it is awake, but not in distress. Small, vague, intermittent, the audible equivalent of existing. She had put him in the box room. It was the smallest bedroom and the coldest, and she was not going to examine whether this was deliberate or simply practical, because she had a routine, and the routine did not include that kind of examination. She had been awake twice in the night for Dudley, and twice more listening in the dark for sounds from the box room. She had not gone in to check. She had lain in the dark and listened until the sounds stopped, and then lain awake until she could hear them beginning again. She gave Dudley his second helping, washed up the breakfast things, straightened the towels in the downstairs toilet, and sorted the tea towels by size. She moved through the morning the way she always moved through the morning, which was efficiently and without wasted motion, and she did not go upstairs. There was time for that. She would manage it in her own way, on her own schedule. She was at the kitchen sink looking at the garden, the November grass, brown and close-cropped, the fence, the backs of the ordinary houses behind theirs, when someone knocked at the front door. She knew before she turned around. There was nothing supernatural about the knowing, nothing she could have been accused of reading from the air. It was simply that the knock had a quality she had not heard before, and already recognized. Too careful, too tentative. The knock of a person who was not certain they had the right to knock. She went to the door. The young man on her front step was thin in the way that suggested he had been thin for some time and had made his peace with it. His coat was too large, not dramatically so, but wrong in the way of something borrowed or second-hand, the collar standing slightly too high, the shoulders almost right. Beneath the coat she could see the hem of something that was not quite clothing, not in any way she was prepared to recognize as ordinary clothing, and that settled it, though it hadn't needed settling. She knew what he was. She had spent 21 years knowing what people like this were and managing accordingly. She had done her best in those 21 years to limit her exposure to the consequences of what people like this were. "I'm sorry to—" he started. She put her hand on the door. 4 nights ago, she had opened this door at 1 a.m. to a creature 11.5 feet tall who had arrived on a flying motorcycle and was weeping when he handed her a baby wrapped in a blanket. He had also handed her a letter. She had read the letter. She had told herself, when she finally went back to bed at 3 a.m. with Vernon asleep beside her and the box room containing a new problem, that this was the worst it was going to be. She had told herself it would not happen again. She closed the door. "My name is Remus Lupin," the young man said from the other side of it, not loudly. "I was James Potter's friend. I know you want me to go." She stopped. She did not open the door immediately. She stood with her hand on the latch and her eyes on the frosted glass, and thought, in a very precise and controlled way, about whether there was any version of this that ended without her opening through the door. She did not find one. She opened it to the width of her shoulder. "James Potter's friends," she said, "are not welcome here. I know that. I have done what Dumbledore's letter asked. I have taken the child in, and I am providing for him, and I would very much appreciate, being left to get on with it without visits." He did not apologize. He did not explain himself further. He simply said, "I only want to see him. Once." She looked at him properly for the first time. He was younger than she had thought. Mid-20s at most, perhaps younger, though he looked the way people look when they haven't slept or eaten properly for longer than they would admit to. There were shadows under his eyes that were not the consequence of a single bad night. He was not threatening. She was aware of this as an observation she resented making, because not threatening was not the same as welcome, and she wished her mind would keep the distinction clearer. "No," she said. He reached into his coat. She went very still. He drew out a letter, folded, worn soft at the creases, handled many times, and he did not hand it to her. He held it at the width of the door, opened to the bottom of a page so that she could see the handwriting. One section only. A few lines in a script that slanted right and pressed hard on its letters. The handwriting of someone who had known exactly what they wanted to say. She did not reach for the letter. She read what he was showing her. "Don't let him grow up without a story. He'll need one." She stood in her own doorway, and she didn't move, and she didn't say anything. She and Lily had had a story, once, before the letter came from the school, with its strange seal and its list of books you couldn't buy in an ordinary shop, before everything sorted itself into what Lily was, and what Petunia was, and what each of them was going to be allowed to have. The story they'd had, before that letter, was the story of two sisters, not remarkable in any particular way. Saturday afternoons and school, and the particular pattern of arguments you have with a sister who is similar enough to be maddening and different enough to be bewildering. It had been a fine story. She had not understood until the second letter came, the Hogwarts letter, addressed to Miss Lily Evans in ink the colour of emeralds, that it was a story she could lose her place in. After that, everything had been Lily's story. Lily's school, and Lily's world, and Lily's friends, and Lily's remarkable, secret, inaccessible life that came home in the holidays, in fragments Petunia was not permitted to understand. She had written to that school herself, once, when she was young enough to still think wanting something was sufficient reason to ask for it. The headmaster had written back kindly, which was almost worse than if he had not replied. She had not asked again. She had married Vernon. She had built something real and solid out of the years since then, something that didn't depend on being allowed. She had a house and a husband and a son and a morning routine, and she had not cried about any of it, not since she was 13, and she was not going to cry about it now on her own front step with a stranger holding out a dead man's letter. She looked at the line again. Don't let him grow up without a story. That child in the box room upstairs. He was going to grow up in this house. He was going to know nothing about any of it. James Potter, Lily's friends, the world that had made Lily who she was, because she was not equipped to tell him, and she did not intend to try. And the school would write to him eventually, as it had written to Lily, and everything would happen that was going to happen, and she would not be able to stop it. And that was fine. That was entirely fine. She had thought it was fine. She had thought, he will grow up ordinary here, and that will be the kindest thing. Don't let him grow up without a story. The young man was still there. He had not moved. He was not trying to persuade her. He was simply waiting, with the patience of someone who had already decided that this was the only thing he could do, and was going to do it regardless. She did not say, "Come in." She stepped back from the door. The hallway was very clean. That was the first thing he noticed, stepping inside. He had expected ordinary. 4. Privet Drive had looked ordinary from outside, looked ordinary from every angle he had viewed it, and the hallway confirmed this in every particular. The carpet was beige. The walls were cream. There was a narrow table along one wall with a vase of dried flowers that had been there long enough to look permanent. The coat hooks by the door had coats on them, arranged by height. The mat read, "Welcome," in large letters. Petunia Dursley had said nothing when she stepped back from the door. She had simply stepped back, and he had come in, and she had gone up the stairs without looking at him. He stood in the hallway and waited. He put his hands in his coat pockets and did not touch anything. On the wall to his right there was a photograph. A wedding photograph, framed in light wood. A man he didn't recognize, large, broad-shouldered, rather pink with the effort of smiling, and Petunia in white beside him, thin and fair and formal, both of them looking directly at the camera with the expression of people who have been told to look happy and are being conscientious about it. He looked at the photograph for a moment. He looked along the rest of the wall. There were no other photographs. Not of Petunia's family, not of holidays, not of anything. A small framed print further down. Watercolor, flowers, a neutral sort of thing. No photographs of Lily. He looked at the stairs. He heard her coming back down before he saw her. Her step was precise, the same precision in everything, he thought, this whole house. And then she was at the bottom of the stairs with a child on her hip, and the child was looking at him. And Remus stopped thinking about the house at all. Petunia held Harry out to him with both hands, the gesture of someone presenting a thing for inspection rather than the gesture of someone giving away something they cared about. He took the child and she stepped back immediately, and he was holding James's son and the child was looking at him. The hair was James's. This was the first thing. He had expected this. Hagrid had said nothing about the hair, but the wireless had said it, imprecisely, about the boy who lived. And anyway he had known before anyone told him, because James Potter's hair was genetically inevitable, a fact of the universe. There was no version of James Potter's child that had any other kind of hair. It was black and it stood in every direction simultaneously, and it had the quality of something that had decided very early in its life that it was not going to cooperate and had never revisited the decision. The eyes were Lily's. He had known this too, in the abstract. Hagrid had said it. Green eyes, like his mother. He had held that information for 2 days. It had not prepared him for the reality of it, which was that Lily Evans's eyes, exactly Lily's eyes, the same shape and the same color and the same quality of attention behind them, were looking at him from the face of a 15-month-old who did not know him at all and was evaluating him with the absolute, unmediated directness of a child who had not yet learned to perform anything for anyone. Harry Potter was looking at him the way very small children look at things, completely and without apology. No social machinery, no performance of interest or disinterest. Just looking, with Lily's green eyes, from a face that was unmistakably James's, the jaw, the breadth of it, the particular set of the brow. Remus was 21 years old, and he had been holding this child for approximately 8 seconds, and he could not speak. He looked at the forehead. He had heard about the scar. Everyone had heard about the scar. It was on the wireless. It was in every conversation. But he had not seen it, and seeing it was different from hearing it in the way that most things are different once you are close to them. It was small. He didn't know why this surprised him. It was a small lightning bolt mark, pale against the child's forehead, neat and decisive, and it was the mark of the curse that had killed his father and his mother, and had, presumably, also been intended to kill him. Harry reached up and grabbed his coat collar. Strong, with the specific strength of children who have not yet learned to moderate it, and looked at it with concentrated interest, then looked back up at Remus's face. He reached into his coat with the hand that wasn't needed for holding the child, carefully, because shifting his weight made Harry's grip tighten, which seemed to be the preferred response. And he took out the letter and unfolded it to the page he wanted, and he read to James's son. He read the parts that belonged to Harry. Not the first things, not the apologies or the explanations that weren't Harry's to hear yet, and perhaps never would be. The Harry parts. He read, "Your eyes." The letter said, "Your eyes look different on a 1-year-old than I expected. More alarming and greener, like your mother concentrated something when she passed them on." He read, "Your hair, which your mother finds tremendously funny, which I personally consider an excellent quality of hair, simply spirited." He read, "You have located the cat and formed a strong opinion about it." He read the part about the broomstick, 2 feet off the ground, barely aviation, but the focus on your face when you get going is something I cannot describe in a way that does it justice. He said, "Your father wrote that. He said you're going to be better than him at flying. He said he knew." Harry was looking at his face. Remus read about Lily. James had written about her here too, a sentence or two, that she had seen something in him worth improving, that he had known from their 5th year that he was going to love her for the rest of his life, which had not been very long but had been enough. He had written, "Your mother laughed with her whole face, the way some people do, and you should know that." Remus read it the way you read something to someone who will not remember it. Carefully, precisely, for yourself, as much as for them, saying the words into the air of a too-clean hallway in a Surrey house so that they had been said, so that they existed somewhere outside the letter, so that James's voice had been in the same room as James's child, at least once. Harry grabbed a fistful of the letter. He said no quietly and extricated the letter from the grip, which required more effort than he expected, and Harry looked at the loss of the paper with an expression of mild reproach before redirecting his attention to the collar. Remus put the letter away. He stood in the hallway and shifted the child's weight a little, and Harry rested his head against his shoulder with the absolute trust that children have before they learn that trust is something you earn, and went, in the space of 2 or 3 minutes, from looking at things to not looking at things to being entirely asleep. The weight of him changed. A sleeping child is a specific weight, heavier than the same child awake, or simply heavier in a different way, settled and complete and entirely given over to being held. He thought, James would know this weight. James had held this child every day for 15 months and had known this weight exactly, the way it shifts and settles, the way the head turns into the shoulder. He thought, James would know what he looks like when he sleeps. James would know what makes him laugh and what the expression is before he cries and what he sounds like in the night. He thought, I am holding James's child, and James doesn't know it. Petunia was in the doorway to the sitting room. He had not heard her come back. She was watching with her arms crossed, and her face doing the thing it had been doing since she opened the door, which was expressing several things simultaneously, and expressing none of them fully. She had not said anything since the stairs. He did not know how long he stood there. Long enough for the light through the front door's frosted glass to shift slightly. At some point, Petunia came forward from the doorway and held out her arms, not urgently, not with any warmth, but with the clear intention of a woman reclaiming something that was hers to keep. And he transferred Harry carefully, the child's head lolling slightly in the move and then resettling, the sleep unbroken. He straightened the letter. He folded it along its original creases and put it in his coat. "He has his father's hair," Remus said. "I'm aware," Petunia said. She turned and went back up the stairs with the child against her shoulder, and her step was the same careful, precise step it had always been, and she did not look back. Remus stood in the hallway for a moment. The mat read, "Welcome." The dried flowers were where they had always been. The wedding photograph looked back at him from the wall. He let himself out. The letter had reached him at 11 o'clock in the morning. He had been in his office. There was always something requiring his attention in the days after a catastrophe, and the aftermath of Voldemort's fall was the largest catastrophe he had managed in 40 years, in some respects larger than Grindelwald because at least Grindelwald had been a single man who could be found and confronted and defeated. When the owl arrived from the Muggle post address he had included at the bottom of his letter to Petunia Dursley 4 nights ago. He had included the address partly because she would feel safer with a Muggle mechanism, and partly because he had recognized the kind of woman she was from a single afternoon of watching her front garden, and the kind of woman she was would want a practical option rather than an open one. He had hoped she would not need it for several years, if at all. He had not hoped very hard. He had known even then that someone would come eventually. He had simply hoped for more time, a year perhaps. Long enough for the arrangement to settle. Long enough for the first urgency of grief to pass. For the people who had loved James and Lily to exhaust their first desperate need to find the child and, finding no way to do so, to go back to surviving. He had given himself a year in his calculations. He had given himself a year, and it had been 4 days. He sat with Petunia's letter for a long time after reading it. It was not a long letter. She was not a woman who wrote at length. But it was a precise one. She had written, "A young man is here. He says he was James Potter's friend. He has a letter. I have told him he may see the child once, because the letter said something I could not argue with. But I am writing to you because you told me to write if anyone came from that world. He has Remus Lupin's name. He is not threatening. He has not done anything that I could call improper. But I am telling you he is here." He folded the letter and put it in the pocket of his traveling robes. He told the portrait on the wall that he would be away for the afternoon. He apparated to the end of Privet Drive. It was mid-afternoon. The suburban street was quiet in the way of streets where the people with children are indoors and the people without are at work, the occasional car going past at the speed limit, a woman walking a small dog near the turn. He walked up the left side of the pavement, and he noted the numbers, and he found number 4, and he found Remus Lupin sitting on the garden wall of number 4, with his coat around him and his hands in his pockets, and his face very still. He had last seen Remus Lupin 3 years ago, at an order meeting in the spring. He had been thin then too, with the particular thinness of someone who was managing things carefully, and would rather you did not ask how. He was thinner now. He had the look of someone who had not slept in 4 days, and who had also, in those 4 days, done several things that would have been beyond the energy reserves of most people, because Remus Lupin had always been efficient with what he had. He was 21 years old, and he looked 10 years older than that, sitting on the wall with his face turned toward the front door of the house, and he did not turn when Dumbledore came up the path. He turned only when Dumbledore stopped in front of him. "You shouldn't have come here," Dumbledore said. "James asked me to," Remus said. He said it simply. Not as a challenge, not as an apology. As a fact, a reported fact, accurate and complete. Dumbledore looked at him and thought, yes, of course he did. James Potter had the instinct of a man who understood exactly which person to ask for exactly which kind of help. And he would have understood that Remus was the one who would come, and he would have asked, and Remus would have come. "Show me," Dumbledore said. Remus reached into his coat and drew out a letter. 2 pages, folded, worn at the creases from handling. He unfolded it and held it out. Dumbledore took it. He read it through completely. Not quickly. He knew James's handwriting. He had written James references for order work, 3 of them over the course of the war, each time recommending him without reservation, because James Potter had been exactly the kind of person worth recommending without reservation. And the handwriting was undeniably James's, slanting, certain, bearing down on the page the way James had borne down on everything he cared about. He read the letter through to its end, and he held it for a moment, and then he folded it carefully along its original creases and gave it back. "I know his handwriting," he said. "I know he wrote this." He sat down on the garden wall beside Remus Lupin. The wall was low and slightly uncomfortable, and he was 100 years old, and the afternoon was cold, and none of these things were reasons to stand when the conversation required sitting. "He asked you to find Harry," Dumbledore said. "He was not wrong to ask. He loved the child and he trusted you, and the request was entirely in keeping with who he was. I am not going to tell you that James was wrong." He looked at the front of the house. The curtains in the downstairs window were closed. "But what James wanted," he said, "and what Harry needs are not the same thing. And you have to understand that, Remus, before you can understand anything else about why this boy must stay where he is." Remus said nothing. He was listening. He had always been a person who listened before he spoke, which was one of the things Dumbledore had always appreciated about him, and one of the things that made him, right now, more rather than less difficult to deal with. "Lily's sacrifice created a protection," Dumbledore said. "A very old magic, older than most of what we practice now. She chose to die rather than step aside, and the choosing made her death do something that a simple murder cannot do. It left its mark on the child she died for, and it left its mark on the magic of this place. While Harry calls his mother's blood relatives home, his own home, that protection holds. He cannot be touched by Voldemort there. He cannot be harmed by what is left of Voldemort there. As long as he lives in this house and calls it home, the mark of her sacrifice keeps him safe." "Voldemort is dead," Remus said. "No," Dumbledore said. "He is not dead. He is gone, which is not the same thing. What happened on the night of October 31st was not a death. It was a destruction of the body, a dispersal of the power. Whatever made Tom Riddle into what he became is not the kind of thing that ends so cleanly. I wish it were. I believe he will return, in some form at some point. I do not know when. But I know the prophecy, and the prophecy is not finished." He watched Remus take this in. The young man's face went very still, the particular stillness of someone absorbing information they had not wanted. "The prophecy says," Dumbledore continued, because there was no softened version of it, and it was better to say it plainly, "that neither can live while the other survives. It was spoken before Harry was born, and Voldemort fulfilled part of it by marking Harry as his equal. The rest of it remains. Harry and whatever Voldemort becomes will have to face each other, one day, in a way that ends the matter finally. Until that day, the boy must be alive, and he must be safe. And this house, this arrangement, this protection, is the only way I can guarantee both of those things. He stopped. The street was quiet. A car went past the end of Privet Drive without turning in. "He cannot be taken anywhere else," Dumbledore said. "Not by me. Not by you. Not by anyone who loves him and means to keep him safe. Because any other arrangement breaks the magic Lily died to create. This is not a preference. It is not a decision I made because I thought it was comfortable. It is a constraint, and I am asking you to understand it as one." Remus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was level, which Dumbledore recognized as something that had cost him something to achieve. "What about what he'll grow up thinking he is?" Remus said. She barely looked at him. Petunia. She held him out to me like something borrowed. She gave him back with the expression of a woman returning an item she didn't ask for. He's going to grow up in that house, knowing nothing about James, nothing about Lily, nothing about any of it. He'll grow up thinking he's ordinary and unwanted, and he'll grow up alive, Dumbledore said. That is what matters now. He heard his own voice say it, and he did not flinch from it, because it was true. It was true, and it was insufficient, and it was the only true thing he had to offer, and so he offered it, and it sat between them on the garden wall in the November cold for a long time before either of them said anything else. The cold had come fully in by now. The street lights were on, and the sky above the rooftops was the deep, sourceless grey of suburban night, neither dark nor bright, the light of a city somewhere beyond the horizon, diffusing itself uselessly against the cloud. Dumbledore had said, "He'll grow up alive." That is what matters now, Remus said. He'll grow up knowing nothing about who his parents were. He'll grow up alive, Dumbledore said again. Not as a repetition, as a position, as the position, the one he intended to hold regardless of what was said next. That's not enough. For now, Dumbledore said, it is the only thing that is enough. They were still sitting on the wall. The argument had not raised either of their voices. This, Remus thought, was the thing about Dumbledore. The thing that made arguing with him something that happened in your bones rather than your throat. He did not get angry. He did not dismiss what you were saying. He listened to every word. And then he said, the thing that made you understand, he had already considered your position from every angle before you arrived, and had arrived at his conclusion before you opened your mouth, and so there was nothing you could say that was new to him, and therefore nothing that would change anything. You've always known this was going to happen, Remus said. Not this, specifically, but some version of it. You've known since before he was born, probably. You've had the prophecy since before Harry was born. Dumbledore did not answer immediately. He was looking at the house. Yes, he said. So everything you've arranged, Remus said, and he heard his own voice doing something he was trying to prevent it from doing, which was becoming unsteady. Everything with the Dursleys and the blood protection and keeping him here. This isn't just about keeping him safe. This is about keeping him in place, for when he's needed, for whatever the prophecy requires. That is correct, Dumbledore said. It was the simplest possible confirmation. Not an apology and not a defense. Not a reframing. Just. That is correct. You're going to use him, Remus said. The word hung there between them. Dumbledore turned to look at him, and his eyes, Blue, even in the dim light, that particular quality of attention that Dumbledore's eyes had always had, the quality of seeing exactly what was there and exactly what it meant, were tired and very steady. Some weapons, Dumbledore said, must be forged slowly, and they must not know they are weapons until the moment comes. The sentence settled into the night air and stayed there. He had expected Dumbledore to deny it, or to soften it, or to name it something that made it less than what it was. He had not expected Dumbledore to say it plainly, without apology or mitigation, with the calm of someone who had already decided that the thing he was describing was necessary, and that the language of necessity does not require softening. Remus sat with the words and found that they did not change. They were not the kind of words that changed when you sat with them. They were the kind that simply clarified themselves, becoming more exactly what they were the longer you looked at them. Remus looked at the house. He did not have an answer. He had an objection. He had a dozen objections, each of them correct, each of them about the cost of treating a 15-month-old child as an instrument of prophecy, each of them about what it would do to a person to grow up carrying that weight without knowing he was carrying it. He had all of those objections, and he could not make any of them, because making them would require him to argue against the thing they were protecting, which was the entire wizarding world, which was every person he had ever known, which was James and Lily themselves, who had died for this. You could not argue against the cost when you had seen the alternative. Through the sitting-room window, a lamp had come on. He could see its light through the gap in the curtains, the warm, amber, ordinary light of a Muggle lamp in a Muggle sitting room on a Muggle street. Someone had turned it on. Petunia, perhaps, or the television. He watched it without meaning to. It was very ordinary and very warm. He said, "Can I come back?" Not to see him, not in any way that would confuse things. Just to, I don't know, sit on this wall, confirm that the house is still there. Once a year, he would never have to know. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Harry must believe this is his home," he said. Not theoretically. Not for the purposes of the magic. He must genuinely believe it, the way a child believes his home is his home. The blood protection holds as long as he can call it home. And he can only call it home if he does not know there is somewhere else. Anyone from our world is a reminder that there is somewhere else. Anyone who stands on this street in wizard's robes is a message to him, once he is old enough to read messages. You do not belong here, and that is precisely what the magic cannot withstand. Remus looked at the lamp. "I understand the argument," he said. "I know you do. And when he comes to Hogwarts, when he's old enough to know everything, when someone tells him, and someone will tell him, who James was, what Lily did, that the war ended because of something that happened to him before he was old enough to understand it." Dumbledore was quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was not withholding an answer, but genuinely didn't have one he could give cleanly. "There are nearly 10 years between now and then," he said. "Many things will be different by the time Harry Potter comes to Hogwarts. I will be different. You will be different. The world will be different. I cannot tell you now how it will go, because I genuinely don't know." "That's not an answer." "No," Dumbledore agreed. "It isn't." The street was very quiet. A car turned at the far end, and its headlights swept briefly across the front gardens, the identical hedges, the identical front walls, and then it was gone. The lamp in the window was still on. Dumbledore stood. He was very tall, standing, taller than the situation made him seem when he was sitting on a garden wall, which was a slightly undignified place for anyone to hold a moral argument, but which had been the available option. He straightened his robes. Then he did something Remus had not expected. He put one hand briefly on Remus's shoulder. Not firmly, not as a comfort exactly, but as an acknowledgement, the physical equivalent of, "I see you. I know what this is. I am not pretending it is nothing." Then he took his hand away, and the place where the hand had been was just cold air. And that felt correct, too. He walked down Privet Drive. He walked at the pace of a man who was 100 years old and had been managing the largest catastrophe in 40 years for 4 days without rest, and intended to continue doing so without complaint. At the end of the street, he did not look back. He simply stopped being there. The particular absence of someone who has disapparated, without a sound, with the efficiency of someone who has been doing it for 70 years. Remus sat on the wall. He did not promise anything. Dumbledore had not asked him to. He understood, in some dim way, why Dumbledore had not asked, because Dumbledore knew him well enough to know that a promise extracted from Remus Lupin under these conditions was not a promise that would hold, and an unextracted non-promise was at least honest. Whatever Remus did from here, Dumbledore could not say he had been misled. He sat on the wall and looked at the lamp in the window. He had been sitting on this wall, on and off, since yesterday evening, which struck him now as absurd. He had slept in a doorway and drunk unidentifiable tea from a polystyrene cup, and stood on this pavement for hours in the wrong clothes, watching a house where a child was asleep, all for this conversation. He did not regret any of it. But he was aware that it was absurd. He was 21 years old, and he was a werewolf, and he had approximately 12 galleons to his name, and no fixed home, and no income, and no family. He could not take Harry. He could not be Harry's father, or anything approaching it. He had nothing to offer a child in practical terms. Nothing Petunia Dursley and whatever her husband was called could not provide better. And the blood protection was real, and Dumbledore's logic was real, and all of it added up to, he could not rescue James's son from this house, because James's son could not be rescued from this house, not by him, not by anyone. Not yet. What he could do was very small. He was going to figure out what it was. He sat on the wall in the cold until his legs were stiff, and the lamp in the window went out. And then he sat a little longer in the dark of an ordinary street that contained, in one of its ordinary houses, an extraordinary child who did not yet know what he was. He had not left. He had told himself, sitting on the garden wall after Dumbledore went, that he would leave when the lamp in the window went out. And when the lamp went out, he had told himself he would leave after a little while, and after a little while had become a long while, and then the night. And then he had walked to the end of the road and found the dry-cleaning shop's doorway again, and that had been the night. The cold had been serious by 2 in the morning, the pavement relentless, but he was 21 and had survived several things worse than a cold pavement, and he had slept in short intervals of an hour or so, and at some point the dark had gone grey, and that had been morning. He found the Muggle Park again, by memory. The bench was damp. He sat on it with his coat around him and watched the light come up over the rooftops. Not dawn exactly, more the slow replacement of night grey with day grey, the sky the same colour with different intentions. A milk float went along the road beyond the park railings, humming to itself. A dog barked somewhere 2 streets over and stopped. He took James's letter out of his inside pocket. He had read parts of it. He had read the parts he needed to read in a rented room 4 nights ago, and he had read fragments of it aloud to a child who could not understand them. He had not read all of it. He had gone past certain parts deliberately, or not quite deliberately. because he had known that holding the letter was one thing, and holding what was in the letter was another, and he had not been ready. He sat on the bench in the grey morning, with the damp seeping into his coat, and unfolded the pages entirely from the first line, and read. The first two things he read carefully. The thank you for 5th year, which he had read before, and which still arrived in his chest as a precise, specific weight. The apology about the secret keeper, which said, in James's particular way, everything that needed to be said without excess. He had read these. He could hold these. The third thing was about Sirius. He read it slowly. James had written about Sirius the way he had always spoken about Sirius, with the fullness of someone whose friendship was so foundational he did not know how to be partial about it, like describing water while living in it. First and best friend. The person who had understood him before he had understood himself. The person without whom, he wrote, he would have been considerably worse, and possibly also considerably less interesting, which was the kind of thing James said when he was being truthful and making it sound casual. Remus read it and thought, Sirius told Voldemort where you were. He thought, Sirius stood on a Muggle street and murdered 12 people and laughed. He thought, James wrote this in October, 18 days before his death, about the person who was going to tell a Dark Lord where to find him. He did not know what to do with this. He had tried, in the first days, to fit it into a shape that made sense, that Sirius had been afraid, or compromised, or had done it to survive. And none of the shapes held, because Sirius had not seemed afraid of anything in his life, and if he had wanted to survive, he would not subsequently have gone after Peter in the street and killed 12 people in plain view, which was not the behavior of a man trying to avoid Azkaban. The wireless had said he was laughing when the auras arrived. You did not laugh like that unless something about it had gone the way you wanted. He could not make James's words and what Sirius had done fit in the same space. He read the third section through to its end, and he turned the page. The fourth thing was about Harry, and he had read most of it. He read it again, the hair and the eyes and the broomstick. And then at the bottom of the page, he found the clause he had missed. Or not missed, but declined, tucked into the last paragraph like a thing James had almost decided not to say, and then said anyway. He had written, "And you." I don't know how to say this without making you sound like something from a book, and you would hate that, so I'll just say it plainly. You are the quietest and the most constant thing I've had on my side, and I've had a lot on my side, but constant is rarer than it looks. You showed up when the others did, and you showed up when they didn't, and I know you didn't always have an easy time of it, and I never said anything about it, which is something I should have said something about. I trust you more than I trust myself to know when to stay and when to go. Remus read the sentence again and again. He had not let himself read this 4 nights ago because he had known what it would do, and he had been right about what it would do, which was that it would simply sit in him like a stone, warm and specific and entirely permanent. He sat on the bench and let it sit in him. James had not mentioned the prophecy anywhere in the letter, had not mentioned Voldemort or the war or the fact that something enormous was coming and that his son might be at the center of it. He had written as if the letter were simply a letter, as if the things that needed to be said were things between people who loved each other, and not things between a man who thought he might die and the friend he was leaving behind. He had made it easy. He had chosen, deliberately, to make it easy, which was the kind of grace that looks effortless and is not. This, Remus thought, was the more devastating version of the document. Not a man writing in fear. A man writing as James. near the end, after the claws about himself, back to Harry. He found the toy broomstick, only 2 feet off the ground, barely qualifies as aviation. The focus on that child's face when he's moving is something I can't describe. He's going to be better than me. I know he is. He folded the letter. He folded it carefully along its original creases. 2 vertical, 1 horizontal, the shape of something that had been written to fit in a pocket. And he held it for a moment, and then he put it back in the inside of his coat, against his chest, which was where it had been since Godric's Hollow. He looked at the street beyond the park. The milk float was gone. The dog had stopped barking. A Muggle woman was walking along the pavement with her coat belted against the morning, going somewhere with the purpose of someone going somewhere specific at this hour. She did not look at him. He did not exist for her in any particular way, which was fine. He did not particularly need to exist for her. One of these streets contained James's son. One of these houses was where that child was going to grow up, knowing nothing about his parents, except what a tight-mouthed woman who resented the whole situation was prepared to tell him, which Remus estimated at very little. He thought, this is the lowest it is going to get. He was not being optimistic about this. He was not saying it the way people say things are as bad as they can get when they are trying to feel better, when what they mean is that they want things to be as bad as they can get, so that the direction is clearly upward from here. He meant it as a factual assessment. He had made a decision last night on the wall, even if he had not yet worked out what the decision required. The decision was that he was not going to completely vanish, regardless of what Dumbledore wanted. He did not know yet what that meant in practice. He would figure it out. The grey morning continued. The bench was cold and he was very tired, and he was, by any reasonable measure, at the bottom of a very large number of things simultaneously. He sat on the bench a little longer and let himself be at the bottom of them. Then he stood up, straightened his coat, and went to find out what he was going to do about it. He went back. He had not decided to go back, exactly. He had stood up from the park bench and straightened his coat and begun walking, and his feet had taken him to Privet Drive, the way feet take you places you have been often enough that the route becomes involuntary. He had spent the better part of 3 days coming and going from Privet Drive. He knew the route now. The street was quiet in the early morning. The curtains were drawn on most of the houses, the few that were open showing the same kind of interior, a lamp left on in a kitchen, the blue-white flicker of a television, the Muggle world conducting its ordinary morning without his assistance. He walked along the pavement and counted the gateposts until he reached number 4 and stopped. The curtains at number 4 were drawn. There was no light visible. He stood outside the gate and looked at the front of the house and did not open the gate. And after a moment he reached into his coat. He had a piece of paper. He had found it in his coat pocket sometime during the previous night. The scrap he had written the address on, in Hogsmeade, Surrey, Little Whinging, 4 Privet Drive, folded into quarters and now unfolded and relatively flat. He had a stub of pencil from the same pocket. He uncapped it and thought for a moment, not long, and then he wrote. He did not agonize over it. He had had 2 days and 3 nights of argument and grief, and sitting on walls in the cold, and he was out of the kind of energy that agonizing required. He wrote the things that needed to be said in the order they needed to be said, without ceremony. He could have written more. He could have explained about James and the letter, about going to Godric's Hollow and finding the envelope under the floorboard, about the 3 days of standing on this street in the wrong clothes, trying to work out what came next. He did not write any of that. Petunia Dursley knew who James Potter was. She did not need the history. She needed only the name and the address, and she could do whatever she wanted with both. My name is Remus Lupin. I was James Potter's friend. I am Harry's. If he ever asks about his father, I would be glad to answer. I can be reached by Owl at the Hog's Head Inn, Hogsmeade. He looked at this for a moment and decided it was enough. He thought, she will not keep this. He thought, she might keep this, precisely because she will want to be able to say she did the right thing. And the right thing in her understanding is probably to keep correspondence rather than discard it. He added, below the address, tell him his father was brave and funny, and he loved him before he was born. He folded the paper, 4 folds, so it would fit through the slot. He opened the gate. He walked up the front path. He had stood at this door yesterday morning, and been allowed in and been given James's son to hold. He was not going to ring the bell at 7:30 in the morning and ask to be allowed in again. That was not what this was. He crouched down at the letterbox and folded the flap back quietly and pushed the note through, and he held it for a moment through the slot, his fingers on the paper, and then he let it go. He did not know what would happen to it. He did not know if Petunia would find it first, or if Vernon would find it first, and he did not know which of those was more or less likely to result in the note surviving the morning. He did not know if Harry would see it in 10 years or never, whether it would be waiting somewhere in that house or ash in the grate. He did not know if the Hog's Head would even be a reliable forwarding address in 10 years. It was a dependable place by wizarding standards, which was not a high bar, and a great deal could change in a decade. He let go of the paper and stood up and walked back down the front path. He latched the gate carefully behind him. He turned left, which was the direction of the end of the street rather than the direction of the park, and he walked. The pavement was the same pavement it had been for 3 days. The privet hedges were the same. He passed the garden wall where he had sat with Dumbledore, the low brick wall, slightly uncomfortable, not designed for extended moral argument, and he looked at it as he passed and looked away. He passed the place on the pavement where the Muggle man with the dog had given him the suspicious look 2 nights ago, a century ago. He thought, James asked him to find Harry. He had found Harry. James asked him to make sure Harry knew someone who remembered. He had done what he could do. The note through the door, the address, the instruction to be told his father was brave. He had done the part that was his to do. The rest of it was in the hands of people and forces he had no control over, and he could not change that. And the honest thing was to acknowledge that he could not change that and keep walking. He thought he had not promised Hagrid not to tell Dumbledore who gave him the address. He had not promised Dumbledore to stay away. He had made no promises in either direction, on any subject, to anyone since this had started. He was 21 years old, and he was a werewolf, and he had approximately 12 galleons to his name, and no fixed home, and no income, and no certainty about any of the things that most people in his position considered necessary for the conduct of ordinary life. He had a letter in his coat that belonged to him, and a name at a forwarding address written on a piece of scrap paper that was now somewhere on the floor of Petunia Dursley's hallway. He also knew where James Potter's son lived. Every year on the 31st of July, which was Harry's birthday, he was going to send an owl to 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He did not know yet what he would write. Something short, probably. He was not going to burden a child with the full weight of this story every year on his birthday. Something that said, I am here. I know who your father was. I am still here. Something that constituted proof of existence, his own, in relation to Harry's. He did not expect the owls to get through. He expected Petunia to intercept them, or for Harry to receive them and not know what to make of them, or for the owls to come back unopened. He expected to send the same owl into the same silence for a decade or more. This was fine. He was not sending the owls because he expected them to achieve something. He was sending them because James had asked him to make sure Harry knew someone who remembered, and a yearly owl, even an unopened one, even a returned one, was proof of the remembering. It was the smallest possible way of keeping the promise. He reached the end of the street. He stopped at the corner and looked back the way he had come. The row of identical houses, the identical hedges, the ordinary November light on the identical front doors. There was nothing to distinguish number 4 from numbers 2 or 6 or 8, except that Remus knew which one it was. He stood at the end of the street and looked at it for a moment. Then he turned away. He took a few steps down the connecting road to the far side of the corner, out of sight of Privet Drive, and he checked that he was alone, and he disapparated. The sharp crack of it startled a pigeon off a garden wall across the road. The pigeon circled, indignant, and settled somewhere higher up. The street was empty again, and ordinary, and still. The summer of 1993 was warm, and the cottage in Yorkshire was not. This was a structural matter, rather than a seasonal one. The cottage had been semi-derelict when he moved in, and had not improved in the years since, and its particular quality of cold was internal, the cold of old stone and inadequate repair and gaps in the window frames that no amount of summer could fully address. He had learned to ignore it. He had learned to ignore a great many things about the cottage, which was either a sign of adaptability or a sign of how low the bar had dropped, and he had mostly stopped trying to determine which. He was 33 years old. He did not look it. He looked older. The face in the bathroom mirror, on the mornings he looked at it closely, was the face of someone who had been worn at by something persistent and patient, and the hair at his temples had gone grey in the way of hair on a body that keeps time differently from ordinary bodies. He had been told once, by a healer he could not afford to see again, that lycanthropy accelerated certain processes. He had filed this under things he was not going to spend energy worrying about, and kept going. He had found and lost 7 jobs since 1981. The losses were all the same. Discovery, followed by a conversation, followed by an ending that was framed as regrettable by the person doing the ending. He had stopped expecting the jobs to last. He had found Yorkshire, which was not a job, but which had the advantage of not being able to discover anything about him and ask him to leave. On the windowsill, beside the single mug he used for tea, there was a small stack of envelopes, 11 of them. He had counted them many times, not obsessively, but the way you count things that represent something, and there were 11, 1 for each year since 1982. On the 31st of July of each of those years, he had sent an owl to 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He had sent short letters, not burdening letters. He was not going to burden a child with the weight of a war and a dead father and a set of circumstances too large for a birthday. Just letters that said, "I am here. I knew your father, I remember." Each year the owl came back, sometimes with the letter unopened, twice with a brief note in a hand he did not recognize. Return to sender. Once with what appeared to be a jam stain on the envelope, which he chose to interpret charitably. He did not know if Harry had ever seen them. He suspected not. He knew enough about Petunia Dursley's approach to the wizarding world to suspect that a yearly owl had been, for 12 years, intercepted before it reached the boy, which meant the boy had grown up with no more knowledge of Remus's existence than he would have had in any other version of events. He had kept sending them anyway. The sending was the point. He had made himself a promise on a park bench in Surrey in November 1981, and he had kept it, and the fact that it had made no apparent difference was not the point. The owl arrived on a Tuesday morning in July, which was warm even for Yorkshire, which was not saying very much. It was a large and self-important bird with the bearing of something that expected to be taken seriously, and it landed on the windowsill next to the stack of envelopes with the air of an owl that had not had any difficulty finding where it was going. He recognized the seal before he opened it. Purple wax, an elaborate D, the kind of seal that Dumbledore had been using since before Remus was born. He had not heard from Albus Dumbledore since November 5th, 1981, when Dumbledore had put a hand briefly on his shoulder on Privet Drive and walked away down the street and disappeared. He had wondered, in the years since, what Dumbledore made of the yearly owls. He had assumed Dumbledore knew about them. He had assumed Dumbledore knew about most things. He opened the letter. It was an offer. Defense against the Dark Arts, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, for the school year beginning September 1993. The letter was characteristically precise and characteristically warm, the combination that Dumbledore had always managed without apparent effort. It said that the position required someone with particular qualities, and that Dumbledore believed Remus had those qualities, and that he hoped Remus would consider accepting. He set the letter on the table and looked at the windowsill. In canon, he assumed from what he had pieced together over the years about how things had gone, Dumbledore had tracked him down, had found him in Yorkshire after years of obscurity, located him with the patience of someone who knew how to find people who did not wish to be found. In this version, Dumbledore's owl had not needed to look very hard. He had been in the same cottage for 4 years. Before that, he had been at addresses he had left with the Hog's Head for forwarding, every time he moved, which he had done 6 times. He had been findable, always by anyone who looked, because being unfindable would have meant Harry's yearly owl couldn't reach him either, and the possibility of Harry's yearly owl reaching him was the thing he had been preserving. He stood up and took the coat down from the hook by the door. It was the coat from 1981, the one he had been wearing on November the 1st when he sat in the pub and made his cold tea, the one he had worn through Godric's Hollow and Scotland and Surrey. He had not worn it since. It no longer fit him correctly. He had lost and regained weight in cycles since then, and his shoulders were different, and the coat had not changed. He had not been able to throw it away, which he had examined as a fact about himself, without rendering a verdict on what kind of fact it was. He reached into the inside pocket. The letter was there. It had always been there. Folded in 3, worn soft at the creases from 12 years of being in the same pocket of the same coat on the same hook, the paper thin and slightly limp and entirely intact. He did not unfold it. He knew what it said. He had read it, all of it, including the parts he had gone past the first time, on a park bench in the grey of a November morning, and he had been carrying it ever since, and he did not need to unfold it to know what was in it. He set the coat down on the bed. He picked up a piece of paper and his pen and wrote back to Dumbledore. Yes. 1 word. He considered whether it required more than that. A sentence of acceptance, a note about conditions or requirements, a mention of the practical realities of his lycanthropy, and whether Dumbledore had accounted for those in the offer, and decided that Dumbledore had accounted for all of those things before writing the letter, because Dumbledore always had, and that 1 word was both accurate and sufficient. He sealed the letter and gave it to the owl, which accepted it with the dignity of a bird that had been expecting to carry a response. He looked at the coat on the bed. He looked at the stack of 11 returned envelopes on the windowsill. Then he reached into the coat's inside pocket and took James's letter out and held it for a moment. The worn paper, the weight of it, which was still nothing, and still somehow not nothing. And he folded it into the breast pocket of his good shirt which was the closest thing he had to a teaching robe, and which would not serve the purpose once term started. He would need robes. He would need money for robes. He would figure it out. He had been figuring out one shortage or another for 12 years, and he was proficient at it. He was going to Hogwarts. He was going to teach the children of the generation that had grown up in the shadow of a war they did not remember. In classrooms he had walked as a student, in a school where the Defense Against the Dark Arts post had been cursed since before he sat his OWLs. He was 33 years old and prematurely grey, and looked tired and ill in ways that were accurate, and he was going to Hogwarts. And in September, on the first day of term, he was going to walk into a classroom, and Harry Potter was going to be sitting in it, 13 years old, in his third-year robes, with James's hair and Lily's eyes, and a scar on his forehead that the whole world knew about. He was going to be sitting there the way students sit in classrooms, with the particular arrangement of a person who does not yet know that this lesson is going to be different from the others. Remus had made James a promise in November 1981. On a park bench in Surrey, in the grey cold of a morning after everything ended, reading a letter that said, "Find him. Don't let him grow up without a story,